Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Myslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Fisher Neal at Hunting Actor is a hunting guide, columnist with Paleo Magazine, professional actor, and theater producer. He's originally from Tennessee and moved to the New York City area after completing his MFA in acting at Yale School of Drama. Fisher has built his hunting teaching business, Learn to Hunt NYC, to help support himself while he's not acting in TV, theater, and opera. Welcome to the show, Fisher.
Thanks, man. It's great to be on.
Yeah, excited to have you here. We were chatting a little bit before recording, and like I said, I feel like many people do that hunting seems like an avenue to get more connected with your food. And a lot of my listeners are probably like me, naive urbanite who has never really been out there with nature, with animals, connecting with them in that way. And a lot of people don't even have a desire to get educated about food. So I'd love to hear, from your perspective, what got you involved in hunting in the first place?
Totally. I got involved initially because it was something that my dad was passionate about. He grew up in a rural part of Tennessee, and I think he started hunting when he was a teenager and was, pretty serious about it by the time he was in college. So by the time I was born, it was a major part of his life. And, so I was exposed to it and had it available to me at a very early age. And it's really honestly been one of the great passions of my life since, 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah, I feel like family is the way a lot of people get into it.
Oh, yeah.
And how did you get into like hunting education, and what does hunter education mean to you?
Yeah, so I got into that kind of because of how weird my life is. I found theater and acting in high school and decided in early college that I wanted to pursue it professionally, and that exposed me to, immersed me in a world of people who are mostly urban, mostly artists are not the type of people who are like out in the woods or, in rural places. So there was intense fascination among my peers in the theater, and they were always, picking my brain and asking me what it's like. And, to my surprise, actually finding it to be something. I think this was just around the time when people were really starting to read Omnivore's Dilemma and be aware of the fact that, there's a lot of ways in which hunting is sustainable and responsible and a good way to get meat. And so that is why I knew that I was just aware that a lot of people wanted to learn, but had no idea where to start. I mean, it's such a steep learning curve. There's so many, it's like, and there's very few resources out there that you can use effectively to learn. So I just thought, the natural need for needing a job when you're an actor, that I ought to give it a try. And that is what led me to be here.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how, can you talk a little bit about your philosophy behind education? Like, do you take more of an apprenticeship model? How do you go about, someone like me who has never hunted before, knows very little about hunting other than maybe the occasional Netflix documentary. How do you get them started?
There's so much that you can only learn through experiencing it. and I guess I would also say that there's just, you learn so much more when you're hands-on experiencing something as opposed to trying to read about it. So I think that is really the focus of what I'm doing, which is to be able to give a person, if possible, as many experiences as possible in a day. Obviously safety is a point of focus. Weapons are dangerous. Knives are dangerous. Climbing up in and out of trees is actually the most dangerous thing that we do. So, I'm always making a point to emphasize safety and how to do everything safely. And then I'm just basically, I'm giving like a fundamental introduction to how to shoot well. And then, what you really need is like, regular practice over years and years so that you can develop, a habit of good shooting, so that when you have buck fever and all this adrenaline going, that your sort of habit carries you through that extreme situation. But I find that it's adequate for most people to have had, an extended shooting lesson in the morning and then turn around and be able to execute on a hunt in the afternoon. And then like after that, I spend a lot of time just trying to introduce, there's just so much, you know what I mean? So I just kind of like initially just skim the surface of everything, so you get a lay of the landscape as to how this all works and, what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And do a lot of people who come to you, have they had no experience whatsoever with hunting, or do you have some people who have hunted a few times before, maybe shot a gun or a rifle once or twice? Like, what does a typical client look like?
I get both of those things, and that I rarely, if ever, get somebody who's like really experienced. I mostly get people who have no clue whatsoever, never held a gun or a bow in their life. That's probably a slight majority. I haven't sat down and done the math as to what that is, but then I get a number of people who maybe they hunted once when they were a teenager or in college and didn't really stick with it or figure it out, or maybe they've hunted like pheasant some and they want to learn how to do deer. I get people who are fishermen who are wanting to learn to hunt now. So a little bit of everything. It's mostly men, but I do get some women. I'd say it's probably like 1 in 10 or 20, female to male. And one cool thing about it also that I really like about the fact that I'm in New York is that I get a very ethnically diverse group of people who come to me. Traditionally hunting is like 95% white dudes. But here in New York, it's like I get everything under the sun, and I get international people as well. You don't have to be an American citizen actually to come here and hunt. So I've taken Chinese and German and Swiss and Korean. It's fun.
Yeah, that's very cool. And what type of commitment does hunting require? Like, is hunting something you mentioned being able to like learn to shoot in the morning and then go execute in the afternoon? Is it something where someone can go and do that and then come back to it 3 months later, 6 months later, and go for a hunt and brush up, be a little rusty, but be okay? Or is it really a skill that you need to perfect continuously? Like, if someone wants to adopt hunting as a hobby, in comparison to other things, like I'm just thinking like lifting or something like, a martial art, what type of commitment is required to really enjoy it? Or is it kind of just whatever you want to make of it?
Well, when it comes to, there's sort of a spectrum of ways to answer that question, because if we're just talking about shooting, if we're talking about a rifle and a crossbow, the answer to your question is yes. You can learn it pretty well, in an hour or two, and have a reasonable chance of probably being just fine on a hunt 3 months later. However, it behooves you to practice more than that if you can. And for me, I'm sort of like practicing by accident all the time because I'm working. So I get the benefit of that. When it comes to hunting with a bow and arrow, though, that is something that requires, I would say, weekly practice for at least a month before the season starts and then throughout the season. Ideally, I would practice more than that. But for me, it's a 25-minute drive to get to the nearest archery range. So once a week is usually about the best I can do in terms of a full practice session. That really, like, if I don't keep that up, I'll switch to the crossbow if I'm bow hunting, because if I haven't been practicing enough recently, the strength in my arms and my form just has a tendency to go bad. And, I really take, and I think all hunters who are responsible humans take seriously the responsibility to be effective in your shooting and not create a situation where you're going to cause undue suffering to what you're hunting. So, I'd much rather just use my crossbow that I know is super reliable than, take the chance that I'm going to make a bad shot with my compound. When it comes to like hunting as a more general thing, it's like a snowball. The more time that you put into it to learn, if we're talking about deer hunting, how the deer behave, what places like to hang out, what the trees are that are in any given area, what the plants are that are growing there, what the deer prefer to feed on. You know what I mean? Like, there's just this endless amount of knowledge that you can accumulate, both generally and locally, to a specific place that you would hunt. And that really is what is going to translate to your success rate. You know what I mean? Like, the more you go, the higher your success rate is going to be, because you just know what you're doing better. You know where the deer are more. You know what I mean? Like, if you only go once or twice a year, you're never really going to learn that much.
Sure. You're not going to get better at it.
Exactly. I mean, the amount that I've gotten better in the last few years that I've been doing this professionally, especially in the last 2 years where it's been full time, is huge. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't have any doubts about when the rut is happening or what phase of the rut we're in, because I'm literally out there every day.
And what's the rut?
So the rut is a slang term that we use to describe the behavioral changes that occur leading up to and during the deer's breeding cycle. So, basically there's actually a lot of misunderstanding about what causes their behavioral changes. But there is a scientific understanding that they're being affected by the length of the day. It triggers hormonal changes in their body. Starting in September, the buck's testosterone goes on a steady rise all the way through late November. It kind of depends a little bit based on your latitude, right? Because we have different lengths of day at different latitudes. But they've taken fetuses from roadkill and backdated them, and they see that like a majority of the does are all getting bred within a 3-day window every year.
Oh, interesting.
So, but what happens is this whole series of things, right? The bucks start marking trees with their antlers, and they start making these scrapes on the ground, and they start going around checking those scrapes to keep tabs of where the does are, and to try and find the one that maybe comes into heat early. And then, as things get more and more ramped up, the bucks are getting more and more charged with testosterone. They're aggressive toward each other. They, start to become way more careless and dumb, and a lot more horny. It's basically, testosterone does the same thing to them that it does to us. And then, so it reaches a point where there's like a total frenzy because the bucks are crazy, horny, and aggressive, but the does are still not ready. And you end up in a point where the deer are literally chasing each other all around the woods for about a week. But of course, how they do that is affected by the weather. If it's hot out, they don't want to chase each other around because, imagine running around wearing a wool sweater, but if it's a nice cold day, they're going to run around like crazy. So you know, sorry, that was a lot.
No, that's interesting. So I am just so unfamiliar. So is that a period of time when you do want to be hunting or don't want to be hunting? You do, because they're all running around like crazy.
Yeah, I mean, especially if your goal is to, you know, if you're interested in trying to harvest a mature male animal, that is the number one time to do it, because the majority of the year those older animals are pretty much nocturnal. You know, they've learned if they move, if they cover any distance during daylight, they're liable to get hunted and shot at. So they pretty much don't move around at all during daylight until that, you know, drive to breed kind of causes them to throw caution to the wind.
Interesting. I just want to get back. You mentioned like the ethical side of hunting, and this is a big reason I wanted to have you on, because a lot of my audience, as you know, are following a carnivore diet, which means eating primarily meat products, like for almost all of your food. Mostly no vegetables, no grains, no processed food, no sugar, etc. So we're getting a lot of meat, and a lot of people, not just carnivores, but everyone is, you know, going to a grocery store. They have no relationship with a farmer. They don't know where their meat is coming from. They go to this well-lit, comfortable, air-conditioned place. I'm guilty of this myself, so I'm not trying to criticize. And, you know, we go in society today and we pick up our meat, and we have no idea where it's coming from or how the animal was treated or how it was processed or anything like that. And I think, you know, like hunting and killing an animal and then bringing it home, processing it, eating it, probably eating the majority of the animal, is people will, I'm sure vegans will say, you know, and you probably get a lot of hate. I'd love to hear it if you do, actually, from people like vegans, for hunting. But in my mind, hunting and like processing the animal and getting your meat that way is so much more ethical than, just getting it from a grocery store. And I'd love to hear, some of the ways in which you find hunting to be a really ethical way of sourcing your food. And then maybe from there we can start talking about, you know, meat processing and that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I mean, yeah, I do get hate from vegan folks sometimes, although I'm not like famous enough for people yet to be tracking me down, you know, to harass me. But I do, if I get to know someone who's vegan, we usually have an extended debate about the state of my hobby and profession. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's no way to know where your meat is coming from unless you were there for it. And even a lot of hunters have this as an issue because they're taking their meat to a deer processor who's doing the butchering for them. Which is perfectly fine. But even in that situation, you don't necessarily know, unless you've talked to the butcher, exactly what's happening with your deer. Though in that scenario, you generally can. You know, the person who runs the butcher shop usually works in the front, and you can talk to that person and be like, so what do you guys do? And they'll say, oh, well, we put it in the cooler to age it for this amount of time, and then we cut it, and this is how we package it and stuff like that. I like to do my own. Partly because butchers here are like far away from where I live. You know, I live in Jersey City, and the nearest butcher is an hour and 10-minute drive. So between the money that I pay and the amount of time it takes me to do the driving, I might as well just do it myself, you know. And it does allow me to make greater use of the whole animal. Most deer processors, they don't save the bones. I mean, the truth is, like, a majority of people who hunt, they eat the meat, but they're not the foodies and the bone broth people and, you know, whole animal food. You know, that's mostly people who are coming from an urban point of view who have that mentality about meat, you know.
Sure.
It's mostly old-fashioned people who are like, I want steaks and I want to put beef fat in my burgers and then have sausage made. So they don't care about the bones, and making stock from the bones and things like that. So the butchers, while they will save that stuff for you, and actually, fun fact, you could go to a deer butcher and get a lifetime supply of free deer bones if you want.
Wow. That's a good tip.
Yeah, it's not legal to sell. So, they're literally just throwing, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of deer bones in the trash every year.
Is that true of the organs as well? Do you know?
Yeah, most of the organs get left in the field. It's about 20% of the deer's body weight. So and you want to get the meat cooled down as quick as you can. So most people, you remove the internal organs out in the field and leave them there. I usually harvest the heart if it's not been damaged too much, and eat that. But most of the other organs I leave. The liver on a deer is very strong flavor, so I don't love eating the liver.
So that's just more a preference thing. You don't need to leave the organs out there.
Right.
Okay. Got it.
But yeah, I mean, if you had a hunter friend, you could probably get them to save. I used to do that a lot for people before I was eating the heart much. I would always save the heart and give it to a friend who was on the paleo diet who really liked it.
Ah, cool.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like, I didn't start hunting as a response to mass agriculture or anything like that. I didn't even really understand that until it became a part of the larger consciousness. You know what I mean? But I was already eating almost exclusively wild game as soon as I moved out of the dorm room while I was in college, because I just had a freezer full of venison, and I was like, why would I spend my precious funds on beef at the store until I run out of this? And I just never ran out. And eventually started. Now, of course, I make a point to only cook and to cook as much as possible with wild fish and game, and with a lot of foraged stuff as well.
And is the meat extremely lean? I imagine a lot of it is from the deer. How do you deal with that? Do you just cook it in a lot of butter, or how do you make up for the fact that it's really, really lean meat?
Right. You do need to cook it differently. You're dealing with, a strong animal that's had to survive and work hard every day. As opposed to an animal that was, pampered and fed an enormous amount of food and never had to physically work a day in its life, and also was probably slaughtered at a young age before its muscle development fully takes place. So there's a lot of difference in terms of how you would want to cook them. There's going to be in venison, there's no marbling of fat at all. There is fat that will be on the outside of the meat sometimes. But honestly, venison fat is kind of waxy and funky tasting, and I discard it. I don't like to eat venison fat. So what I do, the real key is with your steak cuts and your roasts, that you do not overcook. All the moisture that you have is water moisture. So if you cook it past medium, it's going to get dry and tough, and that gamey flavor that people talk about vaguely without knowing, what they mean. They're mostly referring to either fat that was left on there, or they're tasting the fact that it was overcooked. And a lot of after that, it's really just a matter of, understanding the grain of the meat, so that when you cut it and eat it, you cut across the grain. It's never, well, that's not true. It's rarely as tender as beef. But it's also, when it's done right, the steaks that are good for it, the hindquarters and the back straps and stuff, they're quite tender and really delicious. And then everything else, you slow cook or you grind just like you would anything else. The one big consideration with the burger is that since there's hardly any fat that's been added there, if you want to make burger patties or something like that, they really don't stick together very well.
Right.
They can. It's just I prefer to cook them on the skillet, because that way I can flip them without them coming apart, or I mix in an egg or something so that they have some fat to hold them together. But yeah, I mean, other than that, it's really great. I mean, obviously the shanks and the stuff that's has a lot of connective tissue, you really want to slow cook, either as a braise or in a crock pot or something like that to break down all that strong connective tissue. But once you do that, just like pulled pork and beef brisket, that's what you do with tough meat.
And do you do the processing yourself, Fisher, after killing the animal? Like, walk us through what happens post-kill. You have this dead giant buck or deer out in the field. What happens from there? How do you get to, a delicious venison steak on your plate? Walk us through some of the process.
Yeah, so, I remove the internal organs in the field. You basically make a big incision, from the rib cage down to the pelvis, and then remove everything. And I save the heart in a Ziploc bag and drag the whole rest of the carcass out to my truck. I take it back to my house and I hang it up. I actually just moved to a place where there's a shed, so I'll probably start now experimenting, if the weather's right, with hanging the deer for a little while before I skin it or before I quarter it. Because there's a lot of benefit and tenderizing that can come through the aging process that I really just haven't had the opportunity to explore. But so I'll hang it up. So usually I'm just doing this immediately. I hang it up by its head, skin it from the neck, peel the skin all the way off the body, then quarter it, which means I remove all the legs and I bone out all the meat off of the remaining spine and rib cage. And then I'll usually often, depending on how much space I have in my freezer or time to make the stock, I'll harvest the neck bones in order to make stock with. And so usually and sometimes I'll harvest the tongue. I still haven't found a way to cook the tongue that I really like to eat. And it's a little bit of a pain to get at, but,
yeah, I've heard you can slow cook it really well. If you have a slow cooker and then kind of peel it apart like pulled pork. That's apparently delicious.
Yeah. It's I've done it where it was tender, but I didn't quite flavor it in a way that I necessarily loved. But I'm sure that I can. I've heard plenty of good things, and the texture of the meat was really nice. But so then I take all that meat and stick it in my fridge, and from there, I can bust it out onto a cutting board. I break down the legs and cut it into roasts and steaks and set aside scraps for grind and vacuum seal everything and grind up the scraps and trim for burger, and then throw it all in a freezer. And that's about it. The hide and the forelegs and the head and the rest, and the rib cage and that part of the spine all end up in the trash.
Got it. And what does it take for if someone, doesn't live in New York and potentially can't find someone like you, or where are there resources or websites out there where they could find someone to learn to hunt with like you? Do you have any suggestions for that, or should they just do some Googling and searching in their local area?
I mean, Google will get you a long way, I think. The advice that I would give is, start by looking up the hunter education course. You have to take a state offered hunter education course in order to qualify for a hunting license. Once you've done that, you can go and hunt in any state with that certificate. It's also fun tip there. Traditionally those classes are in person. They take a day or two of your time, but it is possible now to do them entirely online in the state of PA for firearms, in the state of Idaho for archery. And they will mail you a valid certificate that you can then turn around and use in any state, because there's reciprocity across the board. So, so that would be one of the first things I would do.
So does someone need to go and get that license before they can learn to hunt with you?
No.
Oh, okay.
The one thing, a big thing that's like one of the biggest issues in the hunting world right now is the fact that hunter numbers are declining. And the reason that that's a big deal is because the entire model of conservation that's been set up for wildlife in our country is based around hunters and hunting and the dollars that hunters are willing to spend on licenses and equipment which has excise taxes that go into a federal fund that's redistributed to the states in order to fund things like buying land and paying for law enforcement and, paying for scientific research that is, learning how to manage not just white-tailed deer, but also like rare bird species and stuff. These fish and game departments, they protect all wildlife, not just the hunted species. So it's a really big deal. And one of the ways that they're trying to combat it is they've introduced an apprentice license in a lot of states that allows for someone who's never taken the hunter education course to go out with a mentor, as long as it's a one-to-one. Every state has a little bit different rules as to how it works. But as a general rule, it's like if you're one-to-one with an experienced licensed hunter, then you can just get an apprentice license and try it out as long as you're with that person.
Got it.
So that's how a majority of my clients end up hunting with me, because I'm acting as their legal mentor.
And do you have to have some form of like gear or something like that to get started?
I mean, yeah, you do need some stuff. Like you can spend tens of thousands of dollars to get all the top of the line stuff. But I would say the initial investment to be like able to hunt deer, for $1,500, maybe $1,000, is probably around what it would take. You want to have obviously a weapon, a knife, maybe a rangefinder or binoculars, some camo, a backpack, and maybe a tree stand. But that's pretty much all you need. And, you can do without some stuff in the beginning. But you definitely, if you're going to do it on your own, the biggest thing is you've got to have, your crossbow or your gun or whatever. Another place that I would really encourage people to look for mentorship. Well, especially if you're a woman, there's a lot of becoming an outdoors woman programs now because they see women as a major demographic that could be expanded within the hunting world. So, there are actually lots of free classes and even hunting trips that you can apply for and go on as a woman, or sometimes as just a new hunter, that's being offered by the state fish and game agency where you live. The other thing I would say is use social media, because there are also these old fashioned forums in pretty much every state where people talk. But I've had really good success on Facebook groups for a bunch of hunters in my state. If it's got 10,000 or more people, if you post on there that you're a new hunter looking for a mentor, it's not out of the question that you're going to find someone who's willing to take you out for a day. You know what I mean? Like there's an awareness among hunters that this is a thing that needs to happen. And, so, I think you're going to find more and more that there are hunters who are willing to, take a total stranger out and just show them the ropes. Yeah.
That's great advice and information. And you mentioned, I've heard different facts thrown around, like how hunting licenses and gear purchase goes to be, like a certain percent of it has to go to wildlife preservation. Can you talk a little bit about that and like clarify some of that, and also maybe talk about the difference between why that makes a big difference between hunting and poaching and the effect on animals?
Yeah. So, I don't know the exact numbers on the excise taxes as to what is taxed and how much. I've kind of looked for it before and not found it. I guess I just not looked hard enough. The initial thing, so what we're talking about is the Pittman-Robertson Act, which is called like Restoring Wildlife Act or something like that. It was made in the 1930s. It was lobbied for by hunting groups. And what it did was it put, I think, a 14% excise tax at like the wholesale level. So like when a retailer buys it from a wholesaler, there's a 14% tax that goes into a federal fund that is then used as a granting program. So say a Fish and Game Agency wants to, like for right now, one of the ways that they're using that money is they've said, here's a grant program to promote hunter recruitment. So propose something to us for hunter recruitment, put up 50% of the money, and we'll match whatever you're putting up. You know what I mean? So then they get $100,000 from, or whatever from the federal, Pittman-Robertson Act to then turn around and have, becoming an outdoorswoman programs for hundreds of people, right? Or whatever it might be, whether it's buying a piece of public land or restoring a wetland that has been degraded, or if it is the other way that they get the majority of their funding, right, is through the sale of hunting licenses. Essentially, the entire model of conservation, as it's been come to known, is a participation model. In order to have wildlife that are thriving, there's certain things that have to happen. You have to have protection so that poaching can be restricted to an extent that it does not have an adverse effect on hunting, on the wildlife themselves. Obviously, poaching still happens, but not nearly to the extent that it would without law enforcement. So all the law enforcement is funded through these licenses and excise taxes, and in terms of like all the scientific research that's done, so that they're constantly surveying habitat and surveying populations through all sorts of means. They're studying harvest data and hunter participation numbers, and using algorithms to determine a pretty clear, a good estimate of like how a population is behaving. Other parts of wildlife science include like understanding how like birth rates and survival rates are going to be affected by a landscape and by weather. And so they're able to determine like whether or not hunting pressure, which is usually what it's not, or habitat, which is usually what it is these days, is having a negative effect on a population. And they can adjust the hunting regulations every year to make sure that, hunting is not having an adverse effect. Or if it's a population that's out of control, that hopefully hunting is having a controlling effect on whatever that population might be. Without lots of people participating and providing the funding that way, they're not going to have the resources that they need to continue doing that work or to do as much of that work. There's been talk before, I think, when an interesting thing is that like there's not something like this for most other forms of outdoor recreation. The obvious thing is that like way more people participate in hiking and backpacking than do hunting, but there's no sort of like, uniform system of participation there where they're all paying into, say, buy up more land to make parks where you can hike in and things like that, or even to protect the wildlife that are within them. Let's see what else. Right. So, in a big other thing about why it works here is because of the legal distinction of animals. Animals here, wildlife, they live in the public trust. They're owned by all of us. When a deer walks onto someone's private land, that person does not own that deer. And that's a big distinction between that and like the aristocratic system that is basically what's in place in Europe. And it is a little bit this way actually in Texas with a lot of things, where like if it's on your land, you own that animal at that time. Obviously it can leave and then your neighbor owns it at that time, but wherever it is at that particular time, it's your property and you can do pretty much whatever you want. And in the case of the aristocracy, right, they, it's like the Robin Hood thing, right? They're going to prevent all the peasants from being able to participate in hunting, you can't kill the king's deer, right? It's a big deal.
Yeah.
So wildlife was able to thrive in that way because it was being protected by an aristocracy. But obviously that's a system in which only, people of the aristocracy are able to participate in hunting. And I happen to think that this participation-based model that we have in the United States is so much more democratic and better, and I think better for the world too, because you really do have so much more of an appreciation for wildlife and wild places when you are directly involved in interacting with it. I really, really want to be sure that there are always deer that can be hunted. And I really, really want to know that there's always going to be migratory waterfowl that are traveling across the continent, and that I'm going to have the opportunity to hunt them. So me and a huge number of other hunters, not only do we spend money on our hunting licenses and things like is required of us, but there are all kinds of NGOs, Ducks Unlimited being the biggest one. They're the world's largest wetland conservation organization. They're founded and supported mostly by duck hunters. So I really do think that more people being able to participate is more of our society has the ability to then appreciate the value of these things and then continue to contribute to it and vote for people who contribute to it and on and on.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting how that legal structure has succeeded in setting up a system that's supporting wildlife in such a productive way, where a lot of similar efforts in our legal structure have failed. Well-intentioned efforts have failed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Fisher, this has been super interesting for me and very educational, and I'm sure my audience will appreciate it as well. Where can folks find out more about you and find you on social media?
Yeah, on social media, I'm quite active on Instagram at Hunting Actor. I also have a Facebook page for the business, Learn to Hunt NYC, that people could check out, or you could go to my website, learntohuntnyc.com. I've got a whole bunch of stuff there. I write a regular column for Paleo Magazine, doing little pieces about how to hunt this, how to hunt that, or whatnot. So they could also find more stuff that I've written there.
Awesome. Well, I'll link to all of that in the show notes at carnivorecast.com. And thanks again for your time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, man. Have a good one.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered? Or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Carnivore Cast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.